I have been shown in the files of the War Department a statement of the Adjutant General of Massachusetts that you are the mother of 5 sons who have died gloriously on the field of battle. I feel how weak and fruitless must be any words of mine which should attempt to beguile you from the grief of a loss so overwhelming. But I cannot refrain from tendering to you the consolation that may be found in the thanks of the Republic they died to save. I pray that our Heavenly Father may assuage the anguish of your bereavement and leave you only the cherished memory of the loved and lost, and the solemn pride that must be yours to have laid so costly a sacrifice upon the altar of freedom.
In May of 1863, the 2 principal armies, followed by the Northern Press, the Eastern Army under General Hooker and the Western Army under General Grant, were positioning themselves to score 2 great Union victories. For Hooker, that hope turned to utter defeat. The loss of Jackson was a terrible blow for the South, and certainly and most directly for the field operations of the Army of Northern Virginia. No officer at the time could honestly and effectively evaluate the emotions of the General Staff down to the men in the ranks at the loss of their world-famous battle commander, but within the next 6 weeks, the plan of march would quickly force the men in the Army of Northern Virginia to finish their lamentations and move onward. Lee would be forced to restructure his army on the eve of the greatest Eastern campaign of the war, the Confederate invasion of Pennsylvania and momentous Battle of Gettysburg. Another result of the Battle of Chancellorsville was the resulting lack of confidence many in the Northern leadership, the press, and men in the Army had with Hooker. He seemed to have been seized with fear after he thought he had Lee trapped. The veteran units of both armies buried their dead, wished their wounded the best, and waited for their next opportunity to strike at their foes, but for different reasons. The Army of Northern Virginia was at its highest peak of confidence it had had since its creation. Both the defensive victory at Fredericksburg and the offensive victory at Chancellorsville had proven that no matter what circumstances it may be thrown into, Lee's men felt that they could take on and defeat any general that Lincoln placed in command to come after them. Once again, the Rappahannock separated the armies, but in June, the distances apart were somewhat farther than in the winter. Most of Lee's men had been concentrated around Culpeper, where Stuart's cavalry screened the army by picketing the various fords within eyesight of Yankee patrols. Union General Hooker was looking to find ways to initiate a redemption for himself and safely strike at Lee. This was to be inaugurated by the newly organized Cavalry Corps of the Army of the Potomac under General Alfred Pleasonton. This opportunity happened on June 9th, 1863, with the frenzied Battle of Brandy Station. Pleasonton was ordered to hit Stuart, and although an unrealistic objective, he was to perhaps cripple or run off Stuart's force, opening a clearer road in the upcoming series of marches against Lee. But at the very least, the Federal troopers would show what they were made of after 2 years of getting bullied and bested by Stuart's troopers, the toast of Lee's army. The Federal strike force of 11,000 men, with some infantry supports, shoved many of Stuart's brigades around in the early portions of the fighting. The Union cavalry came very close to pushing right up on the Confederate cavalier himself and taking him prisoner. Stuart was clearly caught off guard by the branch of service that the Army of Northern Virginia may have often chuckled over in the past, the Federal Cavalry. Brandy Station changed that perception. All types of cavalry fighting took place around the former Confederate headquarters, stables, and parade fields. Regiments charged regiments and fought saber to saber. Some units threw themselves at the enemy, delivering salvos of pistol rounds, and at various instances, cavalry dismounted and used their carbines to slow an opposing force down. Stuart's veterans did manage to stabilize the damage, and the Federals pulled off. Regardless of who claimed victory, the Federal troopers demonstrated their equality to Stuart's best men. For the idolized Stuart, he was heavily criticized for his actions and almost having his corps broken up and dispersed. It was known to many that Stuart was caught unprepared and was more concerned with staging shows than keeping a real eye on Hooker's army. This lingering effect would leave a stain on Stuart's image, and he would attempt to regain some glory in the movements into the north. This attempt would have a subtle but ultimately far-reaching consequence for the tactical decisions made in operations soon to come in Maryland and Pennsylvania. From this ominous start of the Gettysburg campaign, Lee worked on getting his military plans approved in detail in Richmond with President Davis, and the myriad military logistics that needed to be done in absolute secrecy. Davis approved, and because this was a more bold move than the impulsive 1862 invasion, Lee wanted more men, and to take as many men as could be afforded to leave posts around Richmond, Petersburg, and coastal Carolina. Lee would assemble over 70,000 men, and would have the biggest army he would ever have at his disposal. But this army had new commanders, some new units, and marched northward in a state of supreme confidence. The Army of Northern Virginia was well armed, well uniformed, and rather well rested on the eve of this march, unlike the previous Maryland campaign. The Army of the Potomac under Hooker did not realize it at the time, but they quickly lost several days on Lee's army marching northward, and once again, Hooker seemed to prove he was ineffective at coping with Lee's genius. With the leadership at Washington not believing in Hooker, and the ranks and file not trusting him, the relieving of Hooker was assured. In a letter dispatched to Hooker, Halleck wrote,
"Your application to be relieved from your present command is received. As you were appointed to this command by the President, I have no power to relieve you. Your dispatch has been duly referred for executive action."
But Lincoln needed a proven leader in command of the army about to fight its first battle on Pennsylvanian soil. The choices were various, and by this point, in the career of the Army of the Potomac, there were issues of seniority, competence, and who the men would follow. Ultimately, the choice would become Major General George Meade, commander of the 5th Corps. Meade was an old regular officer with a solid reputation as a field leader on the division and corps command. More than that, he was a Pennsylvanian and was generally respected by his fellow officers. General Meade, at his headquarters just outside Frederick, was awakened from his well-deserved sleep on June 28th and was notified of his new post. He wrote in a letter to his wife,
At 3 a.m., I was aroused from my sleep by an officer from Washington entering my tent, saying he had to give me trouble. At first, I thought it was to either relieve or arrest me. He then handed me a communication to read, which I found was an order relieving Hooker of command and assigning me to it.
Meade was officially placed in command of the Army of the Potomac on June 28th, what would be 3 days before the Battle of Gettysburg. By the 30th, the two armies had bumped into each other in Pennsylvania, mostly along the border between Emmitsburg, Maryland, and the Pennsylvanian towns of Fairfield and Gettysburg. It was the Union cavalry that probed Lee's infantry, and because Stuart was still away from Lee and not screening the infantry, Pleasanton's troopers were doing what Stuart should have done for Lee. General John Buford could have let the Confederates enter the town, as some of Ewell's men had already done a few days before, and just watched from the flanks. The veteran Indian fighter decided to occupy and picket the western approaches to town, and in the morning initiate a fight with whatever was thrown his way. The crack of carbine in the early morning hours of July 1st, 1863, was delivered by Lieutenant Marcellus Jones, an officer of the Pickett along the Chambersburg Pike, a few miles west of town. That shot was delivered into Confederate General Heath's division, moving in strength up the road, obviously attempting to bully General Buford's men out of the way. Many men in Lee's army had no idea that the Army of the Potomac had caught up to them, and thought that the blue-coated uniforms around Gettysburg would have belonged to militia and home guard units. Heath's division, led by General Archer's Alabama and Tennessee brigades, along with General Joseph Davis's Mississippi and North Carolina brigade, slowly pushed Buford's dismounted cavalry back. During this fight, the lead elements of the infantry of the Army of the Potomac under General John Reynolds moved up the several miles from their advanced position between Emmitsburg and Gettysburg. The infantry moved past the Lutheran Theological Seminary and relieved the Union troopers not too soon before they may have been driven off. The leading elements belonged to General Cutler's brigade of Pennsylvania and New York troops, and the vaunted and well-known unit of Westerners, often referred to as either the Iron Brigade or Black Hat Brigade, the latter in reference to their distinctive black army hats. The first infantry volley of the battle was appropriately shot by the 56th Pennsylvania on a place just beyond an unfinished railroad cut. The Federals along the cut repulsed Davis, and the Iron Brigade slammed into Archer's brigade in the woods. This close-in fighting would also see the death of the man who was suggested to take command of the Army of the Potomac, Major General John F. Reynolds, commander of the 1st Corps and the Army's left wing. The 11th Corps held as long as the 1st Corps did, but they were being pressed hard and on the flanks. But despite that, would oftentimes charge into the Confederates. One soldier, Sidney J. Richardson, of the 21st Georgia Infantry, wrote home of his respect for the men on the 11th Corps front.
One Yankee regiment charged us, but we all fell down behind a fence and received the charge first before they got to us. I think they fight harder in their own country than they do in Virginia. I'd rather to fight them in Virginia than here, for we had to leave a great many of our wounded in the hands of the Yankees.
The end was slowly coming for the Federals, where many companies and regiments were ceasing to exist. The 24th Michigan Infantry was the cornerstone of the defense in McPherson's Woods, and their service exemplifies the courage of the Federal defenders. One soldier, Corporal Orson B. Curtis, wrote of one of several defenses his regiments put up on July 1st.
A fifth line of battle where he, Colonel Morrow, planted the colors. On this new line, while waving his sword over his head to rally the men, Captain O'Donnell was instantly killed, and Lieutenant Grace received 2 wounds, both of which were mortal. Gradually contesting every foot of ground, step by step, frequently almost surrounded, through and out the woods and over the open field, what was now left of the 24th had been forced back to the friendly rail fence barricade just west of the seminary.
In the end, the 24th Michigan sustained 399 losses of 496 men engaged, and would retreat from the seminary with only 26 men around the colors. The line at the seminary was flanked on the left by portions of General McGowan's matchless South Carolina Brigade, and about the same time of day, Early's division of Ewell's Corps flanked the right of the 11th Corps. The stream of men started to move back through Gettysburg. Regiments on the field that could still form a line often did not want to quit the action. One Federal surgeon, James Fulton, of the 143rd Pennsylvania Infantry, wrote of an incident where he encountered some members of the 11th Corps about this time of retreat.
I tried to get these poor fellows, 11th Corps men, to go on, make their escape to our lines, they being on the retreat. But I could not get them to move, and many were taken prisoners that night who could easily have made their escape. They had, however, done good work, for had the 11th Corps not come up and supported the right of the 1st Corps in that first day's fight, when General Gordon was trying to get around our right flank, the left being slowly turned all day towards the right, but in helping us, the 11th Corps suffered severely.
The Federal soldiers soon found themselves moving rearward, some units in order, and some squads of men and individuals making themselves generals and issuing their own commands. When they emerged from the southern end of town, they found General Hancock, commander of the 2nd Corps, who was sent ahead to assume command of the defense of the heights beyond the town and organize the troops coming upon the field. Also there, and somewhat displeased that Hancock commanded the field, was Howard, who assisted in placing troops on the heights of Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, and Cemetery Ridge. It was organized chaos, but the calmness of Hancock reassured the men. Meade was moving with the trailing elements of the army and would arrive on the field later that evening. The first day of fighting ended with a Confederate victory, but the bloodletting was unimaginable. The 1st and 11th Corps took approximately 10,000 collective casualties in killed, wounded, and missing. A great many of the Confederate regiments fought on July 2nd and July 3rd, so determining their exact casualties on the day is difficult, but some units were torn to shreds. The 26th North Carolina lost almost 600 men in their fight against the Iron Brigade. Whereas officers in the Army of the Potomac would show quick and prompt boldness in their command and control, their enemies were for the first time timid. Lee was on the field the night of July 1st with most of his army. Ewell and Hill bore the brunt of the first day's fighting, with Hill's men taking the lion's share of the casualties. Longstreet's corps was mostly stacked up between Chambersburg and Gettysburg, but would be marching through the earliest hours of July 2nd to get on the field ready for action. The men of both armies knew that the next day would bring on the main bout of fighting. The fighting on July 2nd would demonstrate just how good these two armies were at fighting and methodically killing each other. For the civilians who remained in Gettysburg, their homes were becoming hospitals, and there were dead men and horses in the streets and yards. But some tried to just go on and help the wounded when possible. Most of the first part of the day was spent in skirmishing and probing each other's lines. Lee wanted to attack with his whole force, and that depended on Longstreet's men coming up the pike. Due to some errors in marching and unforgivable delays, Longstreet's corps, designed to launch the attack, was delayed. This delay allowed the Army of the Potomac to get more troops into line and fix its positions. For the Army of Northern Virginia and General Lee, the plan was clear. Hit both the flanks with simultaneous vigor, if possible. Ewell would hit the heights of Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill, the right flank of Meade's army, and Longstreet would slam into the left flank by the Round Tops. A.P. Hill's corps, still smarting from its wounds the day before, would hold the center. As remembered by the civilians of Gettysburg, 4 p.m. and the crash of artillery signaled the start of the attack. Longstreet's assault would move right to left with a front of nearly a mile. One of the leading units in those attacks was the famous Texas Brigade in General Hood's division. This brigade was renowned for its ferocity in the attack. Earned at places like Gaines Mill, 2nd Manassas, and the cornfield at Sharpsburg, and now in front of them was the 3rd Corps of the Army of the Potomac, occupying strong positions at the Devil's Den, and behind them, Little Round Top and Big Round Top. Once the Texas Brigade was ordered to advance, they eagerly stepped off into the fight. Soldier J.B. Polly of the 4th Texas wrote of that moment.
We moved quietly forward down the steep decline, gaining impetus as we reached the more level ground below. The enemy had already opened fire on us, but we did not stop to return it. Forward, double quick rang out, and then the Texas turned loose. Across the valley and over the little stream that ran out through it, they swept, every man for himself. The first man down was my right file man, William Langley, a noble brave boy with a mini ball straight through his brain. I caught him as he fell against me, and I laid him down dead.
This attack by Hood's men smashed into the 3rd Corps, the fighting along the heights getting close and much apart from the traditional linear tactics of the time. Units moved around boulders and trees, and the fighting became much like Indian fighting that many of the Texans were familiar with. The defenders of the 3rd Corps could not hold their left flank around those heights, and a call for reinforcements was sent out. The 5th Corps would be on the way, but Sickles' men would have to sell out to buy that time. The action around the Texans at Devil's Den and the wheat field moved quickly as other troops attacked past the Rose Farm and Peach Orchard. Sickles' men were doing exactly what the 1st Corps did the day before, trading lives for time. The artillery of the Army of the Potomac supported the infantry with reckless abandon. This combat was no better described than by a staff officer surveying the fighting. Lieutenant Adolfo Cavada, a Pennsylvanian of Cuban origins, wrote of the Confederate attacks and his own troops' heroic defense.
A copious shower of shell and canister from the enemy was followed up by a diabolical cheer and yell, and "Here they come!" rang along our line. At this moment, my horse was shot in the leg and pranced around frantically. Our batteries opened. Our troops rose to their feet. The crash of artillery and tearing rattle of our musketry is staggering and added to the noise of our side. The advancing roar and cheer of the enemy's masses coming on like devils incarnate.
These attacks at the Peach Orchard were led by General William Barksdale's brigade of Mississippians, whose men pierced the Federal center there. The Mississippians were tornadoes, wrecking the Federal lines along the Emmitsburg Road. The combat was close, too, ranges usually less than 50 yards. Sickles himself was removed from the field, seriously wounded, but his troops retreated and made stand after stand, fighting and pulling back. It was brilliant fighting on both sides, and the casualties mounted. The question was, how long could the Confederates keep on with the same intensity on that hot July day? When Colonel Strong Vincent's brigade and other troops rushed to the Round Tops, the Texas Brigade and the Alabama troops astride them could make little headway. General Hood was down wounded too, which may have slowed the coordination of taking the heights. Counterattacks coming across the northern face of the Little Round Top showed that there was seemingly endless supports arriving behind Union lines, but there was no way to know where from and how many. Once again, valuable intelligence was lacking because Stuart was not on the field. Portions of Hill's Corps, which were to go in after Longstreet's men, started to make headway on the ground in front of the Cemetery Ridge, but coordination in the chain of command faltered and the attack slowed to a halt. Federal troops, often directed by General Hancock himself, counterattacked, most notably the 1st Minnesota Infantry, which charged into a Confederate brigade and lost over 80% of its men. Each unit fought like their nation's life depended on it, and they took the steam out of the attack. The action would shift to Culp's Hill, where the fighting would become even closer and desperate amongst the fortified positions that the 12th Corps built there since the early morning hours. But, unlike the fighting south of town, this fight would be of a much smaller scale in a confined space. The 7th Indiana Infantry was the first unit posted on Culp's Hill, and that by Hancock's direct order the night of July 1st, and then later that night more troops joined them. Paul Truitt, a sergeant in Company K, 7th Indiana Infantry, wrote of the defense there.
At 3 o'clock in the morning, the 12th Corps came and joined us on our right. Green's brigade of the 12th Corps, composed of New York troops, joined us. We fought on that line the 2nd and 3rd days. The rebels charged on this line of troops repeatedly, and at times they came over the breastworks, but our men stayed right there and fought the rebels to a finish. We had a better location than they and were better protected. We had a crossfire on the rebels, and we could help our New York boys stand the Johnnies off. Those New York troops did as hard fighting as I ever saw men do. I walked over to Culp's Hill to see what we and the New York boys did to the Johnnies. The ground was literally covered with dead men. They were piled up on each other 4 and 5 deep. One couldn't walk without stepping on the dead bodies. The trees in front were shot down by our mini-balls.
It was fighting that would ultimately repeat itself on July 3rd. But the fighting shifted on the night of July 2nd to East Cemetery Hill. There, the Louisiana Brigade of General Harry Hayes, the Tigers as they were called, charged upon the artillery atop the hill, fought hand to hand, and in the darkness were counterattacked by elements of the 2nd Corps. While that was being enacted, Colonel Isaac Avery, commanding the North Carolina Brigade on right of the Tigers, was stricken and mortally wounded. He found his last moments occupied by having an aide assist him in scribbling a note. "Tell Father I died with my face to the enemy." That sad affair ended with the repulse of the night attack, and nothing more would occur until the climactic events of July 3rd. The Confederates hammered both flanks of the Army of the Potomac, and with equal resolve, the Bluecoats held the line, inflicting ghastly casualties upon Lee's veterans. Meade held a council of war late the night of July 2nd, and the Corps commanders of the Army of the Potomac agreed to hold the line rather than pull out under the cover of darkness. Meade let it be known that he thought Lee tried both flanks and failed, and thought that if there were another attack in the morning, it'd be directed at the center, thought to be possibly the weakest position of the Army of the Potomac. For Lee, he turned to Longstreet, his war horse, for the leadership to orchestrate and attack Meade's center. At about 1 p.m., Longstreet had all his forces organized for a bold strike against the center. His forces consisted of Pickett's division, fresh and ready to go, Pettigrew's division, formerly Heath's, who was recovering from his wound of July 1st, whose troops were completely battered, and then a supporting force of 2 North Carolina brigades commanded by General Isaac Trimble, who finally found a command. All told, the force numbered approximately 12,000 men. The signal guns may have been fired around 1 p.m., but that is often debated as everyone seemed to record a slightly different time. But sometime between 1 p.m. and 2 p.m., the attack commenced. The artilleryman who was tasked with coordinating the bombardment prior to the attack was E.P. Alexander, a sturdy and true West Pointer, and a genius of artillery tactics. Alexander wrote of the beginning of the most famous attack of the war.
So I wrote another note to Pickett and sent it at 1:35, 10 minutes after the first note. For God's sake, come quick. The 18 guns are gone. Come quick, or I cannot support you. I sent 2 written and 1 verbal message to that effect, for I was afraid of their losing time in their little preliminaries, and I wanted to get them inspired to disregard everything but getting there. On getting the first one, Pickett rode to Longstreet, who was nearby, and showed it. Longstreet read it and made no comment. Pickett said, "General, shall I advance?" Pickett paused a few seconds and saluted and said, "I'm going to move forward, sir."
Longstreet was actually frozen with disapproval, as he believed the attack would fail and did respectfully suggest that to Lee. But at this moment, his order was not needed. Every officer, especially the gallant Pickett, knew what needed to be done. Pickett rode to his men and got the brigades moving forward. Garnett and Kemper would be in front, with Armstead in support. Everyone in the command staff knew he was attacking his old pre-war Army friend, Hancock. Armstead told his men to remember their homes, families, and Virginia. Pickett was on the right flank of the attack, and Pettigrew on the left, with Trimble in support. They were ordered to a converging point, or a concentration point on the Federal lines, near a copse of trees adjacent to an abrupt angle in a nearby stone wall. That is where they would hopefully pierce the lines of the Army of the Potomac. It was a wide open field and almost a mile across. The artillery of both sides pounded each other for quite some time. In Pickett's division alone, hundreds of men were knocked out of the ranks before they even cleared their own lines. The battle lines were miles across, but Pettigrew and Pickett had to concentrate and connect their men, and that took place just before the Emmitsburg Road. Before that time, dozens of Federal batteries pounded the attackers. When the troops reached the road, they found themselves in musket range of the infantry, behind slight fortifications ahead of them. That last 200 yards to Federal lines was one that none of those Confederates wanted to cross, but cross they did. Some of them rated themselves high over the turnpike fence, only to be cut down, and the remnants of Garnett's brigade surged towards the angle near the copse of trees. Kemper bogged down behind the Cadore farmyards just south of the angle. His men were getting flanked by General Stannard's 9 months Vermont brigade. Armistead rushed his men up to the road and tried to get his men along to help Garnett. At some point in the fight thereafter, the alien general, who was mounted, moved up close to the angle and a blast of canister obliterated the Virginian. His horse trotted back towards Armistead's men. Not too far from this, Kemper was also shot down, but not before some of his men had briefly pierced the Federal lines south of the copse of trees. Those men, as remembered by survivors of the battle, raised the rebel yell and took several steps forward when Captain Andrew Cowan's New York battery unleashed 6 cannons of double canister at about 30 to 40 feet. The Virginians vanished into a pinkish red mist. That left Armistead to accomplish the objective. Not knowing that the attack was crumbling, Armistead came up towards the angle with a good number of his men and some remnants of Garnett's brigade. With about 200 to 300 men, he was conspicuous with his hat atop his sword. He called on the men to follow him and reminded them that home was just over those hills. Some of Pickett's men also got a prize for a good shot, as General Hancock was shot from his horse and, like Kemper, seriously wounded. Men were falling fast on both sides. The bravest of Pickett's men kept moving and over the stone wall with Armistead. This surge broke the Federal lines, with Virginians being joined by some elements of the right flank of Pettigrew's force, Tennessee troops from Archer's brigade. The spot was in front of Lieutenant Alonzo Cushing's United States Artillery Battery. Cushing had already fallen, killed by several shots, one of which went through his mouth as he was giving his last command. It was upon Cushing's artillery that Armistead poised and directed his men. It was there that he was shot down, mortally wounded. By this point, the attack had completely fallen apart. Most regiments were busted up into squads or clusters of men protecting their colors or helping their wounded. Trimble was shot down in these final moments, just as there was a universal falling back of all the troops. This retreat was nothing more than these clusters of men planning what would be better, surrender or risk death on the retreat. Pickett's survivors, those that were not killed, wounded, or captured, moved past General Lee near the Confederate lines. The commanding general told them it was his fault and they had done their work nobly. At first, Lee tried to react with due propriety, as the military situation would call for. Lee told Pickett that he should reform his division, to which Pickett reminded Lee that it no longer existed. He was not far from the truth. There would only be several hundred men that would reform, and they did not stop retreating until they got a few miles from the battlefield. From the lines of the Army of the Potomac came a chant of Fredericksburg from some of those regiments in the 2nd Corps that got wrecked in a similar fashion attacking the stone wall there. The combined casualties of both sides was approximately 51,000 men, or of the approximately 160,000 men that entered the battle, a brutal number to comprehend. But the campaign was not over. Lee offered a defensive battle from his own men dug in through the 4th of July. Some skirmishing was conducted throughout the next day, but Lee got his men going back towards the Potomac. The retreat began with moving a 17-mile-long ambulance wagon train in motion, on a far track away from possible Federal attacks. Then, through the mountains, Lee's army limped along, often with downpours of rain, making the plodding through the mud even more miserable. Eventually, Lee's men would get to the area around Williamsport, Maryland, and there found the Potomac swollen and impassable. Lee's men would be harassed by Federal cavalry the entire way, with Kilpatrick nipping on the Army's heels all the while. The feelings of many of the Army may have been summed up by Colonel David Aiken of the 7th South Carolina Infantry. Aiken was not completely downcast by the defeat, but offered this explanation to his wife. He wrote,
"By tomorrow night our wagons may be across, and if the enemy does not attack us, I think,
or rather hope, I will take up our line to march for Virginia soil. This would be cheering news to this army. I don't think General Lee or anyone else will ever get back into Maryland again. I never want to try it over, certain.
By the time most of Lee's men had gotten back into Virginia, the news of events happening in Mississippi had reached the army. Vicksburg, the strong bastion along the Mississippi River, had fallen. Vicksburg was a product of Western soldiering and campaigning, where wide, sweeping movements often culminated in a battle 100 miles from a previous engagement. The distances seem to have been greater, and in the early phases of the war in the West, controlling the riverways. There was no doubt at the time that Grant was the right man for the job in the West. His victories in 1862, Forts Henry and Donaldson, and then Shiloh, launched Grant's career, and along with some other subordinates, such as General William T. Sherman, would offer a tandem stronger perhaps than Lee and Jackson. That cooperation was needed to crack the Gibraltar of Vicksburg that everyone all the way up to President Jefferson Davis knew was the nailhead that kept the two sides of the river together. If the city was taken, it would surely give the entirety of the waterway control to the Federal Army and Navy. The first actions against it would come in December, when Sherman took his command, split from Grant's, and with those 32,000 men, came in from the south. Grant, with 40,000 men, would come in from the north, or the direction of Holly Springs, the federal base of operations. By the start of the April campaign against Vicksburg, Grant's Army of the Tennessee would consist of approximately 75,000 men. His primary opponent, General John Pemberton, a Pennsylvanian loyal to his new home in the South, commanded approximately 44,000 men of the Army of the Mississippi. General Joseph Johnston, the senior field commander in the campaign, attempted to coordinate with Pemberton, and to Johnston's dismay, Pemberton failed to accomplish anything. With additional victories against the forces of Pemberton at Champion's Hill and then Big Black River on May 16th and 17th, respectively, Grant seemed to be leading an unstoppable force. His men eventually bullied Pemberton's men back into their fortifications at Vicksburg. This set the stage for the first assaults on the defenses there. Johnston wanted Pemberton to save the army over the city, but Pemberton refused and planned to make the price of taking the city too high for Grant. On May 22nd, elements from Grant's army tested the defenses of Vicksburg. This type of attack was exactly what the defenders wanted, and the Confederate defenders inflicted 3,200 casualties in a matter of a few hours. It convinced Grant that he would lay on a siege against Pemberton. Rear Admiral David Dixon Porter would join in on the investment of the city with his gunboats, designed for using mortars and arching shot and shell as Vicksburg sat atop a bluff. The men in the ranks were not unused to digging in and getting dirty, but this settled-down style of military activity would be well remembered by the men in blue. One soldier, Lucius Barber of the 15th Illinois Infantry, carefully recalled the development of his engineering skills on the Vicksburg lines. It would be typical of the vast majority of Grant's men. He wrote,
"One day, General Grant rode along the line and told the boys he had plenty of ammunition and not to be afraid to use it. This was the signal for firing. Some of the boys expended over 200 rounds that day. The Rebs lay in their trenches whilst, like mice, not daring to show their heads. Some evenings we would crawl to the top of the hill near camp and watch the gunboats shell the city. From the instant the shell left the gun, we could trace its progress through the air. The terrified inhabitants sought safety in caves from these terrible engines of death. A practical engineer could so time the fuse to explode the shell whenever he wished."
There were weeks and weeks of skirmishing, constant sharpshooting, and occasionally a pitched sortie against the position just to test its strength. Ultimately, it would be the continued strain on the population, the reduced rations of the troops, and the knowledge that the Union Army was only getting stronger that made the garrison begin to wonder how this siege could possibly end with anything other than a surrender. For the 4,000 or more residents still within the city, they certainly would have been under similar thoughts, but they were civilians and did not sign up to be shot at. With no relief coming, and the people in the city resorting to eating rats and horses, Pemberton waited only until the first days of July to begin entertaining the thought of meeting with U.S. Grant to discuss terms for surrender. The 4th of July was a momentous day in American history to both Northerners and Southerners. But on that day, in 1863, General John Pemberton made a decision that would profoundly shake Southern morale and alter the course of the war in the West. Pemberton decided to surrender Vicksburg and give it to Grant and to the Army of the Tennessee. The Army of Mississippi surrendered approximately 30,000 men and 172 artillery pieces of all sorts, especially dozens of siege guns. The news of both Gettysburg and Vicksburg was spread throughout the North. Church bells in the cities from Chicago to Boston and all points of the Union rang out. The Eastern and Western armies had both won momentous fields against the Confederate armies. It was a turning point in the conflict, or at least it gave the Northern leadership and population renewed fervor to prosecute the war. And in the South, the words Gettysburg and Vicksburg were uttered in sad, hushed expressions.
87 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.